The Brackeys game jams haven't been quite the same since he died, but nevertheless, I feel a strange obligation to participate. The theme for this jam is Let There Be Chaos. When I think of chaos in video games, I think of the minigames in Super Mario 64 DS. I've been thinking of Mario 64 DS a lot recently, as a matter of fact, so while I didn't have any particularly grand programming ideas in mind, I did have visual inspiration. So that's what this jam was going to be for me. Not a test of my programming concepts, not an exercise of my ability to perform under stress, but instead just a little test to see if I can make a visually pleasing game inspired by DSi graphics. So naturally, my first idea was a VR game where it doesn't matter because that's already overscoping. But my second idea was a wave shooter, where enemies would appear all around you and you had to fend them off by shooting them. You would also have a menu where you could design custom robots with different unlockable gear and then strategically place them. You know what, I'm not doing that. Let's stick with the first part, wave shooter. Sounds manageable. And with a wonderful world of possibilities around me, I set up the camera so that it would render onto a texture with a resolution of 256 by 191. DSi hardware enthusiasts will note that this is just 1 pixel shy of the console's screen resolution. This is of course a result of me misreading what it said on the wiki and only realizing it as I write this script. Acting as if all were well and good, I started designing textures for the game. I began by getting some colors in the general areas where I wanted them, and then I used Asperite's convolution matrix recursively to generate some beautiful textures. Honestly, I'm not sure why it doesn't get talked about more often. It works great. Crosshair, wide crosshair, perfection. This is a disturbingly long segment where I couldn't figure out how to make the projectile continuously point at the camera, which is required to maintain the illusion of depth. And this is a HUD that was supposed to be placeholder, but made its way into the final game. At this point, however, the game wasn't fun, which is kind of a big deal in my opinion. Granted, gameplay options were still pretty underdeveloped at this point, but I thought that at least looking around might instill some kind of levity. So I played Bob-omb Squad to refresh my mind and ended up beating my high score for the first time in at least 8 years. Please! 56,000! Woo! Not only was I refreshed, but also full of adrenaline. I completely overhauled the gameplay loop, adding vertical camera turning and later FPS movement. Perhaps it's a lazy way of solving the fun crisis, but it's tried and true, and I don't really care. For some odd reason, I had the sudden urge to make a first-person version of that one jungle level in NSMBWii that nobody likes. With the OST as my BG, I started writing a script that would allow the player to run around on a boat that was slowly drifting downstream. I managed to get it working seamlessly. However, when I saw the endlessly empty world surrounding this river, I couldn't help but feel that I was overscoping. So I took a quick break to see how many pineapples my computer could handle. I sure hope this doesn't affect lag. The next day, I got a little more serious. My goal for the jam was to see if I could successfully replicate the visual style of 3D DSi games. So I went to NoClip to study the source material. Mario 64 DS is a beautiful game, right down to its unfiltered textures. So after browsing for some more specific ideas, I landed on my main muse. This screenshot right here. My flurry of ideas was beginning to settle. In the middle of some industrial setting sits a pineapple that must be guarded at all cost. That was my idea. So after some prototyping, I landed on this badass looking arena. Coding from here on out wasn't too hard. Tedious, perhaps, but not complex. Here's shmenty-million brick balls going after the pineapple, here's the 3 lines of code that make up the enemy AI, and here's a cool particle explosion I made. I usually avoid the particle system because I find it a little overwhelming, but considering how much fun it is to use, it's kind of a null excuse. At this point, the game was fun.
Oh my gosh. Oh no!
However, I didn't want to rely on user-generated sound effects, so I dedicated my efforts to matching sound effects together in Audacity. It was a joint effort, of course. Some sound effects came from freesound.org, and some were from my face. This is one of my favorite bits. I wanted to make it clear when enemies were going to start spawning from each avenue, so I created this little gate lifting sequence, which I think totally benefited the atmosphere of the game. Animations, UI, sound effects. If it wasn't for the fact that the enemies were still placeholder balls, I'd say this game looked complete. So, say hello to our little robot friend, who I later named the Tropi-Choppa. I had a bunch of enemy types planned, and I wanted this to be the lowest level, so I kinda went for that pathetic Goomba grunt combo, and ended up with this thing. I think the asymmetry and bouncy animations turned out really well, and I love watching it bounce down the corridor. After some difficulty tuning, sound balancing, and general polish, I made my final addition to the game. A title animation using a camera parented to an empty in the center of the level. It slowly rotates around the Y-axis while oscillating along the X-axis. My dad and I came up with the title Stop the Tropi-Choppa, and I made a logo based on various fruit companies. The game was submitted 1 day and 2 hours before the deadline, as we had a weekend trip planned, so I wanted to get it out of the way. I'm actually super happy with how it turned out. I think that lowering my expectations for the project allowed me to properly divide my attention onto different aspects of it, and create a more cohesive experience. Fellow jammers seem to like it from what I've seen, with the main criticism being the mouse sensitivity, which is completely fair. I may update the game after the jam to add some control options, but for now, that's all. I think I would have to call this a successful experiment and one of my best games to date. Link in the desk for those interested, and with that, I bid you adieu.